The Earth is a closed system, which means, for the exception of solar radiation, things don't really get in or leave the planet. So, in order for life to persist, everything needs to be recycled and reused. Biogeochemical cycles are the ways that elements travel between the different spheres of the Earth so they can be recycled and reused. The cycles that you are expected to know are the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the water cycle. Many elements will cycle through all the different spheres of Earth. So most elements will have a residency in the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere,
Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked.
and the biosphere. Now, before we get into the details, there are a few definitions that you need to know so you can get a full understanding of how these cycles work. A reservoir is any place where an element has a long residency time, or how long it stays in one place. A flux is movement. It's when an element changes form and moves or flows, fluxes from one place to another. Photosynthesis is an example of a flux. It's how carbon moves from the atmosphere, where it's stored as carbon dioxide, into the biosphere, where photosynthesizers use it to make glucose. Fluxes occur from sources to sinks. Now, any reservoir can be a source or a sink depending on if the element is coming into it or if the element is coming out of it. For the example of photosynthesis, the source for carbon is the atmosphere, and the sink for carbon is going to be, well, the plants as part of the biosphere. The carbon cycle is the movement of carbon or molecules containing the element carbon from sources to sinks. A cycle has no start or end point, but when discussing the carbon cycle, I like to start with the atmosphere. Carbon can move from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, where it ends up in plants stored as glucose. But a lot of photosynthesis actually happens in the ocean, where the phytoplankton absorb the carbon dioxide and also do photosynthesis to make glucose. Carbon can then move further through the biosphere when organisms eat the plants and then later get eaten themselves as you move up the food web. However, carbon can also leave the atmosphere in one other way. It can dissolve into bodies of water, where a chemical reaction occurs between the carbon dioxide and the water, and a chemical called carbonic acid is formed. Carbon can be returned to the atmosphere through respiration, right? How organisms make energy, where we use the glucose we ate for energy and we exhale it back out as carbon dioxide. Respiration is not the only way that carbon can be returned back into the atmosphere. It can also be returned through some natural processes like a volcanic eruption. It could be returned through forest fires. Even the process of decomposition returns carbon containing molecules into the atmosphere. Of course, the one we're all familiar with is combustion, right? The use of fossil fuels can also return carbon into the atmosphere. Fossil fuels is a way that carbon that has been stored in the lithosphere can be returned back into the atmosphere. But how did the fossil fuels actually get into the lithosphere? Well, for that, we have to go back to our phytoplankton friends in the ocean. See, after a while, as phytoplankton live out their lives, after they die, they kind of sink to the bottom. And over a long period of time, These layers sort of build up in a process called sedimentation. Now, after a super long period of time, the layers get squeezed and compressed and squeezed and compressed, and eventually it turns to a form of rock, going from sedimentary to metamorphic through the rock cycle, and it ends up as the fossil fuels that we use. Fossil fuels are a long-term storage of carbon in the lithosphere. In fact, rocks have the longest residency time for carbon, and the combustion of fossil fuels is upsetting the carbon cycle because there is an excess amount of carbon being put into the atmosphere from a reservoir that generally has a long residency time. Let's get into the nitrogen cycle. And I found that the nitrogen cycle is one of the more difficult cycles to fully understand. Now, the nitrogen cycle is the way that nitrogen or molecules containing nitrogen cycles through the environment from sources and sinks. The nitrogen cycle is what we call a fast cycle. The reservoirs of nitrogen don't have a particularly long residency time for the element in its various forms. Before we get into the cycle, there's a couple of terms and processes that I want you to know the definitions for. Nitrogen fixation is the process of taking nitrogen gas in the atmosphere and converting it into ammonia. This can be done in two ways. The most common way is that bacteria facilitate the process. We call it nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and convert it to ammonia and store it in the soil. This process can also happen through lightning. Lightning can also convert nitrogen gas into ammonia. Then there's the process nitrification, where ammonia is converted into a different molecule called a nitrate. This process is also facilitated through bacteria that we call nitrifying bacteria. Now, the reason nitrification is important is because nitrates is an easier form of nitrogen for plants to absorb than ammonia, at least in terrestrial ecosystems. And the last difficult term is denitrification. Denitrification is a process by which nitrates are converted into, well, nitrogen gas that ends up going back into the atmosphere. This process is also facilitated by bacteria that we collectively refer to as denitrifying bacteria. The key here is when you're thinking nitrogen, I really want you to think about microbes. Bacteria facilitate a large amount of this cycle. Let's begin the nitrogen cycle also in the atmosphere. Nitrogen can be fluxed from the atmosphere through nitrogen fixation through bacteria, or it can be fixed through lightning. Now that we've got ammonia, probably in the soil, nitrification can occur where bacteria take the ammonia and convert it into nitrates. Both ammonia and nitrates can be assimilated by plants. Now again, nitrates are the preferred form of nitrogen that plants like to take in, but they can also absorb ammonia, and ammonia is the most common form of nitrogen that you will end up finding in aquatic ecosystems. Once the nitrogen is assimilated, plants can use the nitrogen inside those molecules to build molecules that are important to them that contain nitrogen. Things like DNA and proteins all require a source of nitrogen in order to be synthesized. Nitrogen can further move through the biosphere as one organism eats another. At the end, nitrates can be denitrified and returned back into the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. Now, much like how our use of fossil fuels has disrupted the carbon cycling on planet Earth, humans have disrupted the way the nitrogen cycle works as well. Um, Two scientists are credited with contributing to a process called the Haber-Bosch process, in which we synthetically make ammonia, and that becomes part of our fertilizer. Through the use of fertilizer, we are artificially increasing the amount of nitrogen that ends up getting assimilated by plants. The phosphorus cycle is the way the element phosphorus, or molecules containing phosphorus, cycle through the environment between sources and sinks. As opposed to the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle is actually a very slow cycle. That's because the major reservoir of phosphorus is actually rock. The most common form of phosphorus that tends to cycle through the environment is a phosphate, a molecule that contains phosphorus. Now, because the process is so slow, phosphorus in most ecosystems ends up being a limiting resource. With the phosphorus cycle, I want to start with the mountains over there because they contain rocks that have minerals that contain phosphorus. Now, when it rains, a process called weathering occurs where little tiny bits of this phosphorus is being washed away and it runs off in the soil or bodies of water and it gets deposited elsewhere. Well, those small broken downs of phosphorus can now be assimilated by plants. And of course, plants use the phosphorus that they have assimilated to build molecules that require phosphorus, like the backbone of DNA. Phosphorus can then move further through the food web as one organism consumes another. Those organisms require phosphorus not only for their own DNA synthesis, but also because phosphorus, for animals especially, is important for maintaining our bone structure and the health of our teeth. Of course, after some time, the phosphorus can then be incorporated back into the lithosphere as things die, decompose, and pile on top of each other. Humans have affected the phosphorus cycle as well because it is a limiting resource in many ecosystems and is necessary for plant growth. We have been adding it to our fertilizers and, again, artificially increasing the amount of phosphorus that is being assimilated by plants. Did any of you notice that phosphorus has no residency time in the atmosphere? That's something that makes the phosphorus cycle unique and something I thought I'd point out that it doesn't really hang out in the atmosphere much at all. The water cycle is one that I'm sure all of you are the most familiar with, right? It's the way that water moves throughout the environment, and this entire cycle is powered by the sun. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Earth is a closed system, with the exception of solar radiation, and it really is the sun that allows all of these cycles and processes to occur, but most especially the water cycle. Let's just get right into the water cycle. Let's start with evaporation. We know that water can go from the hydrosphere into the atmosphere through the process of evaporation, but there's actually a couple of other ways that this can happen. Plant cells store water, and when they lose that water or it evaporates off of the trees, we have a special process name for that called evapotranspiration, and that's all the water loss due to the plants. Water can also go directly from its solid ice stage into the gas phase through a process called sublimation, but sublimation tends to happen relatively slowly. Of course, now that we have water in the atmosphere, it can condense into clouds and then fall as rain, which we call precipitation. Sometimes instead of rain, the water falls as snow on top of mountains, and when spring comes, all that snow melts and all that water runs off. So there you have water runoff. While water running on top of the land is called runoff, when the water gets into the ground, we call that infiltration, the process by which water infiltrates the ground. Well, when the water actually gets into the ground, it doesn't stop moving. It percolates through the ground. Percolation is how water moves through the ground. And this is important because the ground actually contains a large amount of water. We call it groundwater, a water table, or an aquifer. But infiltration of water and then percolation into sources of groundwater is an important part of the water cycle. Of course, we know that the ocean is the largest reservoir of water, but that's salt water. That's not really accessible to us. Ice caps are the largest store of fresh water, but we don't really have access to the ice caps for drinking water. So we rely on freshwater sources, especially groundwater, for a large amount of our drinking water and water that we use for our crops. So groundwater issues are actually very important in this class, and we will talk about them later. And thus wraps up this video on biogeochemical cycles.